Thank you very much, Tom. Real pleasure to be here. Fantastic event, and I really like what George said as well. So what it says here is two hats, really. They work very much together. The one I'll start with is the CFA Institute Global Board hat. So I've done that for 6 years. Fantastic experience through that time. Really lovely board and a lovely organisation. And one of the most important things that I was involved with was building a new, more expansive strategy at the CFA, which was called Bolder Mission, Broader Mission, Bolder Voice, and Bigger Community. You can see why I stumble over those 3 Bs. Now, one of the critical elements of that was to deliver something in this area of future finance. And just a little bit of context about what that is involved with here is to do with the engagement of the whole industry in kind of making a better future. So the future needs your work. It's very much an opening here. I'm not trying to present anything from the Institute itself. I'm saying we actually need work to restore trust in this industry. And that represents, in a sense, one of the sort of greatest challenges for all of us is to think deeply at a time when things are very, very stretching. And that's why I've got this subtitle, If Not Us, Who, If Not When, If Not, which way round is it? If not now, when, yeah, thank you. Now, when we actually look at it that way, I think the challenge in our industry is just so significant at the moment. And from that point of view, restoring trust is a very resonant phrase. The other very resonant phrase is change. And really that's something that I've worked on throughout my career, and that's what's going to come up a great deal in this session. So let's dive in. I want to work a little bit more towards the purpose of finance. And really our specializations here are all so much to do with working a piece of a bigger chain. And it's in small print, but basically so much starts on the left-hand side with savers, and so much finishes up on the right-hand side intergenerationally with savers returns and that word externalities that George has referred to, essentially. So savers returns come with some kind of nasty stuff. And in between, you know, all of this is about intermediation of a huge sort here. And how we deal with that intermediation is actually very interesting at the moment, because really this is a very powerful industry for doing great good, but it has a few stresses and challenges in it. And those are really captured at the bottom of this slide. The shortcomings of costs, trust, short-termism, and externalities. All of these come kind of as a price of our chain not working in the way we'd like it to do, but being very clunky. And all of these are genuinely, when we estimate the impacts, multi-trillion-dollar issues. All of those, if we fix them, we would be a lot better off. So what we have to think about here is how we might do that. And that really does start with an understanding. One of the key dimensions of the Future Finance Initiative is to put forward the idea that this is an ecosystem. And we actually have to understand all these linkages and where these linkages are taking us. And that understanding kind of starts with understanding a few of the trends that we recognize in the industry at the moment. Let me just give you a short, sharp tour around a few of the things that are going on in our day jobs wherever we are. So, organizational change. Now, the Red Queen race is actually a very interesting invention of Lewis Carroll, which is basically we have to run as fast as possible to stay still. And really that is the characterization of alpha, of course. But really it goes deeper than that. It really does characterize exactly what our jobs have seemed to be. Because every year I sort of get to the end of it and think, wow, that year was harder than the one before it. And that does characterize the normal, the new normal in the financial system, in our respective financial services organizations. And as we get to the New World Order here, I just call out really the potential for imbalance to really kind of put us off the rails. So geopolitical imbalance, which is characterized by diffuse power, what I call G0. The macroeconomic imbalances we have in our economic system, essentially, with the differences between the West and the rest. And a huge issue building up, limits to growth, natural resource scarcity, adverse demography, natural resource imbalance again. And all of those are actually making the new normal very, very difficult. And then we're actually trying to kind of do a better job with our investment model. And that's what I call the great investment revamp, where there is increased systemic risk for sure, because the 30-year floods are coming every 3 years, as I see it. We actually have the opportunity to work risk better, but we haven't quite got on top of it. We won't ever get on top of it, but we can actually do a better job with that management. And we haven't really got our frameworks necessarily settled. And I think that is really to do with there being the chance of an investment retread, which actually takes you away from the Chicago school, which is very classically based and very narrowly based towards something that respects behaviors and both endogenous and exogenous risks. And this is really an opportunity for things to really move forward. Now, I call it first balance because we're all on top of those sorts of things. And really, it's about execution to deal with those types of challenges. Now, in the investment dilemmas section, I just want to highlight so many things are pretty much business as usual. But we have to recognize that going forward, investment return is challenged by financial repressionary conditions. And so the betas that we take from our world are actually down, and people are stretching that much harder to make up the differences here. A number of issues to do with integration of new thinking, particularly the sustainability area. A number of issues about why we do so much with alpha when managing our future and managing our risks represents a more important challenge than the alpha. And thinking a lot about what's happening in the decumulation of retirement income. At the moment, really, the world does not have a very efficient system when people reach their retirement of actually turning those sums into retirement income. The defined benefit system is great where you have a defined benefit system. But really, there's only 3 significant countries that have that defined benefit system left intact. One of them here. And lastly, the more responsible role for investment institutions, which actually I think is one of the areas where we will see a great deal of movement. So I'm going to work over to this word change now. A busy slide, but it represents, in a sense, a representation of the sort of work I get involved with, managing the change at asset owners, the change process for asset owners. And change starting at the top. And I want to emphasize the asset owners because they're so critically important to the future of our investing state. They're becoming more and more influential, and the world-class asset owners, of course, include organizations like PGGM and APG, very local here. So really, they have new challenges of a very significant sort here. And my work is out there trying to help them with the investment model, which is risk budget on the right-hand side. But that's so incomplete. It doesn't represent the major part of their task, which is putting the conditions in place, the infrastructure in place, the human capital in place in order to be successful with that risk budget model. And the emphasis here is very much on bringing those 2 budgets together. They all have scarce resources in them. So governance budget applied to risk budget is really the enterprise that we're involved in if you're involved with an asset owner. And so from that point of view, what we're trying to get to here is a framework by which more effort is put into that front end with that word governance very heavy within it. And it starts with very fundamental things about mission and goals. And whilst people are very sort of negative about mission statements, in many respects, to slog through truly shared values with respect to mission is always a very worthwhile activity. Now, I'm just going to give you 3 examples of this change work being applied to asset owners. I'm going to name 3 organizations here. So a very good example of transformational change, the CalPERS organizations in California, California Pensions. It's a very large $300 billion pension fund, one of the biggest public funds in the world. And their process was trying to settle the differences that existed in their board and in their executive team with respect to issues like sustainability and their intergenerational commitment. So really, it's a funded scheme that actually has many stresses, and public pension funds in the US are looking, in some cases, like a slow-motion train wreck. So organizations like this going through change, thinking deeply about their circumstances and trying to settle their differences. And these quotations are largely from the CalPERS organization saying the process that they went through, which was actually settling their investment beliefs, was one that they actually drew a lot of benefit from. So a very good example of change management. And CalPERS is a very public organization. You can actually see all their reports on the web. You can even look at all their meetings live on the web, an extraordinary open, transparent accountability. The Railways Pension Fund in the UK, by the way, I spent the best part of a year with CalPERS, and the organisation that came after that was the Railway Pension Fund in the UK, the same sort of approach, trying to manage a coherent approach, starting with beliefs, finishing up with investment model. Processes that actually involved capture of a different type of approach, particularly to the words culture and leadership and sustainability. And I'm going to make reference to those in a minute. An organisation very close to home, some of you will be familiar with the investment framework that PGGM was able to deliver and has now to execute in its 2020 investment framework. Again, a very interesting example of shared beliefs going into a really excellent document that actually sets out a plan for the next 4 or 5 years by which PGGM transitions to being a very modern investment organisation. So all of them, I think, very interesting examples. Now, all of them share, I think, the characteristic of doing something very strong when it comes to culture and governance, and also the sustainability of their operations, integrating a number of transformational factors that exist in the world today. British Queen, the Jubilee. So this is the poster that was on the Thames a year ago, and it's 100 metres by 70 metres. And my big point here is that there is that little man putting up a little section of the poster who cannot see the big picture, and he is critical to the output, but he has no concept of what this whole creation adds up to. And the importance of the big picture that all these organizations have developed enables them to start with themselves, very much the self. You could actually say that's the individual, the team, competition and opposition. All of these organizations are competing for returns and talent, extraordinarily so, and the wider stakeholders that they represent. Very complex institutions when you see it that way, and grasping the big picture is critical. So it really does come down to two particularly important new factors, I would argue, culture and the area of sustainability. Let me just give you a couple of glimpses as what's involved under those words. So culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's a quotation. It's Peter Drucker. It's quite cute. I mean, it's fairly obvious that we work very hard on strategy, but we don't so much work on culture. We kind of expect it to come good. It's a very different type of idea. And really, we argue a lot about good and bad culture. There's no single best practice for culture, but there truly is good and bad culture, good and bad features in culture, and it is accessible. And so these organizations have to think deeply about whether or not this culture is suitable for the changing markets, the changing landscape that they have. And one of the things that's absolutely fascinating here is how strongly culture is defined by the drive and purpose and mission of the organization. And so in asset owners, and large numbers of asset owners, but not all asset owners, you have extraordinary drive and purpose for the benefit of beneficiaries, for pensioners, for better lives. And that isn't so true when it comes to asset managers across the world. There is a difference, really, between our investing institutions that act as principals, the asset owners, and the differences that come with being an asset manager who actually operates mandates for these organizations. And that drive and purpose is going to be different in those other places. Now, this is not to kind of point fingers at the culture of asset management, although I kind of indirectly am challenging the asset management industry to work harder on its culture with respect to that purpose. Because that purpose is not about being shareholder-centric and internally focused. It so much must be about being externally focused. And so culture all too often supports self-interest rather than client interest. My observation, but calibration of that idea really is very clear. It is the case that the financial services industry has actually increasingly focused on managing its bottom line, on quarterly capitalism, as opposed to being very expansive with its ability to serve clients and be fiduciary in the way that it operates. Now, that's a very complex sort of set of issues, and that is the world that asset management faces here. But culture can be changed, and the opportunities to do good things here, and George had this word empathy, which I love as well. I think the leadership, empathy, and empowerment is actually the means to achieve this relative to other types of incentive structures that are based really around compensation and the like. Right, the last bit of this section really, which is to do with part way to solution, is just to refer to the importance of sustainability as a topic of our time. And I just want to make reference to some Towers Watson and Oxford University and industry research, which combined a number of things. Now, this is about 18 months ago, but the uses of this research are actually very, very current. The world is entering a significant transformation in economies, in politics, in societal attitudes. Just look at this Thomas Piketty thing going viral across the world. In environments, in technologies, and in capital markets. All of these are actually changing at a rapid pace. I mean, I lose count of how many presentations say that, but actually the doubling of complexity is actually becoming a sort of 5 or 7 year type of thing. The pace of change is accelerating, and we can quantify that. So strategies have to pick up a whole heap of new dimensions to their challenge. And most strategies are very much based around, let's benchmark over 12 months, let's benchmark over 3 years. But essentially, to enter the world of transformation, you have to pull in some sort of dimension as to how these factors will hit you over a 10-year period, beyond the mandate that we know and we're comfortable with. So the plan B type of thing is very much a business beyond usual type of concept here, which actually has to adapt to the longer term. It is a different way of investing because we've kind of got used to the idea that we can do a good job quarter by quarter. That adds up to the long term. But it doesn't if you actually think about these longer term factors. And a subject like stranded assets and how to think about investing in a whole heap of fossil fuel dominated companies, how that might materialize as a risk over 5 and 10 years, actually brings that point to light. We're quite stretched on timing, so I'm actually now sort of moving into 3 slides really, which are kind of suggesting something different about the way people should invest. And these messages are meant to be prompts for the whole industry. And again, I repeat, what we're trying to do here is actually just get the engagement going. So let's talk a bit about sustainable structures. The word structures is meant to be quite broad here and represent the idea that guided capitalism is the way forward, not market fundamentalism, which seemed to be doing quite well, but then ran massively aground in the global financial crisis. And what that means in terms of having guided capitalism is actually having a combination of the right sort of regulation with the right sort of spirit and culture in the investment industry itself. And stewardship is a very neat word. It doesn't translate brilliantly across Europe, I have to say, but stewardship is a very neat word for saying, actually, we want to invest, understanding what we're investing in for the longer term, and having some sort of discipline with respect to the codes of corporate governance that go with that. Corporate social responsibility. Corporations that we invest in should actually have a sense that they have stakeholders and they have to be very careful about being too shareholder driven. Too shareholder driven is my point. They have to take account of other stakeholders. And just one last one, fiduciary capitalism, a new term, but essentially what we've had in the investment industry is a very dominant financial capitalism. The private equity firms, the global equity firms, the global investment management firms have been the dominant form of capitalism that we had. Fiduciary capitalism comes from the asset owners of our world. And pension funds represent the title to $35 trillion of personal assets across the world. And back to capital in Thomas Piketty's book, that capital actually has a heart if those asset owners actually take a responsible attitude to how they invest in the longer term, which is tied up to a concept that is growing in force around what people refer to as universal ownership. The idea that long-term investment institutions have to take a long-term view because they have nowhere to go, and the sustainability of the system becomes very critical to them. So idea one, that you need that sort of sustainability in structures. Idea number two, that our organizations need a bit more focus, and that focus needs to be more around the word professionalism than we've had in the past. So it's less commercialism and more professionalism. The word professionalism, I think, does register in an asset owner context, but actually we need to extend it across the whole investment framework. And just one example taken from the CFA world here is governance. Acting in the highest standards of governance. What do we mean by that? Well, a very practical answer. The CFA has its asset manager code. Many people here will recognize it. And it has been propagated very successfully in some parts of the investment industry. It has, I think, a huge future in calling out strong governance and strong principles and strong ethical orientation amongst our asset managers in the world. So I think all of those sort of represent ideas by which we can do a better job with focusing our efforts to the benefit of both our clients and ultimately ourselves and our organizations. But it's the orientation that I think needs to have a change of culture. The last idea is actually very much, you could say, the tool of our industry is measurement. And investment management is about as measured an industry that exists on the planet. I mean, we have everything in 2 decimal places, but we don't necessarily have the true meaning that lies behind 2 decimal places of performance. And the critical factor here is that we actually have lost sight of a number of the soft factors that will make a difference in our respective businesses. So from that point of view, in order to understand soft factors, we have to have more transparency of what's important. We have to represent, I think, the idea that governance is one of the most crucial inputs to success of all. And governance goes very much hand in glove with leadership and with culture. Those three actually make up a very, very solid triangle. And something in that area has to be very much looked at as critical to future success. Now, one of the interesting things there is you'll immediately say, well, they're all absolutely squishy and not very measurable, but anything like that is truly accessible. Really, people can make an assessment on some sort of pro forma basis as to how those things are being developed. And that does represent, I think, a step forward here, that we are talking about measuring and assessing more things than we've done in the past. That represents a stretch for the industry, but certainly does represent a step forward. Measurement gives the subject respect, and many of the reasons why these things have been undercooked in the past has been because they haven't been measured. Now, the last two on this list is really to do with a change of emphasis in how we report. And again, we've been, I think, too seduced to think it's all about the results. It's all about the results. And there's a phrase amongst corporations which I like very much, which is profits with purpose. It's a phrase that was actually first put forward by Indra Noy of PepsiCo. You know, as the sense that not all profits are born equal. It's very similar in asset owner space. Performance with purpose. Not all performance is born equal. It's a very important concept, really. And as we represent the idea that we are stakeholders to both performance to the future generation of beneficiaries, but also we are stewards of their interests, I think we take a huge leap forward. So what I'm going to do is sort of wrap up that piece and just leave you with one further thought about the CFA's position in this. So second bounce of the ball, very important. So just think rugby for a minute, because the ball actually has got unpredictability. And therefore, what I'm suggesting here is that as we think ahead, we actually have to identify a number of trends that could be out there, but actually a lot of what we're talking about here is how we get to that situation. Longer term trends like this, unpredictable, needs the adaptability of our organizations. And so this doesn't represent a prediction to me, but it does represent, I think, a stretch for us to think about and to visualize and to make that future of finance a reality. Make that restoring trust in that future of finance, in particular, that reality. And so I think that the investment industry has got so much potential that has not yet been realized. And so from that point of view, this is asking for something of some change in the way we do things with the better course, as I put it, which is longer, deeper, wider in the way that we think about our future. Change is hard, but change is absolutely needed on the basis of what I've just put forward in my view, because the exposures to risk that we've created in the financial system are fairly significant. And the cultural response, signing up to a less self-centered investment industry, signing up to innovation, signing up to that change represents, I think, the step forward that I truly believe is the right one. So let me just finish by sort of switching star sheet here and actually turning to CFA Institute, the global representation of the future of finance here. So on the right-hand side, we have a number of topic areas that the CFA has kind of set up, the sort of taxonomy of what it's up to. Very interesting for local societies to be very engaged in those sorts of areas. Now, what I think is difficult is kind of picking out, you know, what's critical. And that's why I think it's so interesting to see how society events like this are evolving. I've had involvement with several, and all of them have kind of picked out different things for different purposes. I was actually doing a society event in Toronto this week. The focus was very much on another part of the industry, which is how we do the wealth management of our industry, how so much of this is very personal to individuals, and how wealth management kind of needs to adapt its mechanisms to be more sensitive, more fiduciary in its attitudes, and really take on a role that's a lot broader, you could say, a lot more about counseling as opposed to just adding value. And so, you know, that's just an illustration that we can all make something of it, and I do think that it's critical for each of the societies to have their respective positions here. So this is an initiative that obviously is trying to work between the Institute, the global part of the CFA, and its local societies across the world to find some answers. It's a solutions-based proposition, but I'm not in any sense saying these events are giving you answers. They are just, in a sense, raising some questions and giving some commentary about the sorts of things that lie ahead in managing the future of finance for the benefit of society, which is one of the key statements that we make in our mission at the CFA. And the CFA method is through both thought leadership, thinking through these issues, but critical to this event, it's really about engagement and getting people thinking and debating some very difficult subjects. So thank you very much for staying with me so far, and I will leave it to the next part of the panel. Thank you, Tom.